I'm Doug Sobey, the president of the Quebec Area Historical Society, and I want to introduce most of you, or many of you, will know Dr. Edward MacDonald. He's spoken here twice before, I think just twice, possibly.
Surely.
And we've asked him back again. His topic tonight concerns the Loyalists, and the title is on the board there. And the Loyalists are very close to our hearts in this museum. We tell their story in the museum. But I'll tell you something about Dr. MacDonald first. He's an island native from the other end of the island, Northport, which is near Georgetown, or roughly that area.
Newport.
Oh, Newport. Okay, yes. Well, there you go. Yeah, Newport. I don't think I've ever been in Newport, but I'm not sure.
There were people that lived there that have never been.
He is a Professor Emeritus at the University of Prince Edward Island. He began his career at the Prince Edward Island Museum and Heritage Foundation, where he served as curator of history and longtime editor of its popular history journal, the Island Magazine. In 2000, he joined the Department of History at UPEI and taught there until his retirement in July 2024. Ed MacDonald has authored, co-authored, edited, or compiled 12 books, 2 exhibit catalogues, and over 50 articles exploring various aspects of the social, political, and environmental history of Prince Edward Island. And among his books, and you probably have read some of these, but if you haven't read this one, you've got to get it, and I think it's probably still in print, If You're Strong-Hearted, Prince Edward Island in the 20th Century, published in 2000 to give a complete coverage of the 100 years in island history, which had received before that very little coverage at all. And more recently, with Alan McEachern, Dr. Alan McEachern was here 2 weeks ago, and they jointly produced The Summer Trade, a history of tourism on Prince Edward Island, published in 2022. His most recent book is in an entirely different field of literature, but also history, I think. It's called The Geography of Home, Poems for a Lost Time. And it was shortlisted for the Prince Edward Island, a Prince Edward Island Book Award earlier this year. And you may have already read poems in the Red magazine, in which Dr. MacDonald publishes regularly. He's a frequent speaker to various groups within the island community, and you will often hear him on the radio, possibly, or sometimes on television, acting as a resource to media, attempting to understand the historical roots of contemporary issues. And I have heard him frequently in that capacity. In recognition of his service to teaching and island heritage, he was named to the Order of Canada in December 2023, and a year later he was invested with the Order of Prince Edward Island. So the island was catching up with the country at that stage. Usually they were the other way around, and so he is now, he retired, as I said. This is his second 2 years of retirement, but he hasn't really retired like most academics and historians. It's a life pursuit, and I want to welcome you, Ed, to speak to us tonight on the topic of injustice and deception, the Loyalists and the land question on Prince Edward Island. Ed.
There you go. Of all of the books and articles that supposedly I've been involved with, I've not ever published anything on the Loyalists. And so I feel like a bit of a fraud, but I was asked to give this talk, and my wife has said on occasion that I apparently can't spell the word no, and had difficulty saying it. So when the Loyalist Association asked me to give a talk, I picked something that I thought I could say something about, and Doug unfortunately was there, and he said, I think you should do that in Bedex. So that's why I'm here. But I really want to give credit. Much of what I'm going to tell you this evening is the product of work done by my friend Jack Bumstead, who died a few years ago. He was well known as a Canadian historian and expert on Lord Selkirk, Scottish immigration to Canada, among other things. But in his work, Jack discovered P.E.I. And he did a phenomenal amount of really excellent work about the history of P.E.I., especially the Selkirk settlement. Published, I was joking, I was giving a talk to the CHA in June, and I was using that slide of Jack. One problem Jack had was he occasionally made problems, he made errors in terms of who was related to who, and down in Belfast, destroyed his credibility completely. He had someone as somebody else's uncle when they were in fact their grandfather. Anyway, Jack published a booklet on understanding the Loyalists, who were the Loyalists, and he also published an article in the Island magazine while I was editor. So I plundered that, and I also stole some slides from Doug Sobey, who actually, Doug loaned me the slides, which I've added to this talk. So this talk takes a macro approach and then kind of narrows down to Prince Edward Island, because I want to begin by talking about who are the Loyalists? What do we mean when we talk about the Loyalists? Because growing up, I thought I knew what a Loyalist was, and I thought I knew why they were Loyalists, and it turns out I was only partially right. So, just to remind you, I'm told there are a couple of Americans in the room. We're not picking sides here, but as you may recall, in 1775, the Americans rebelled against the British Empire and embarked on a war of independence, which they called the Revolutionary War, and succeeded. So this is a slide by an artist that I admire. But you know, a surprising number of Americans did not support the rebellion. As many as 500,000 remained loyal to Britain. And one small footnote, one little reminder that we think of the United States, or what became the US and Canada, as separate units. But remember, in 1775, Nova Scotia and Quebec were colonies of Britain, the same as Rhode Island and Connecticut and Massachusetts. So, in theory, we could have also rebelled. Not sure why, but we could have. But 500,000, up to 500,000 people remained loyal, actively or passively loyal. Of that number, 19,000 actually fought on the British side. And after the war, many Loyalists simply stayed in the United States. But many chose not to, or were forced to leave. And we're not sure exactly how many, 60 to 80,000 of the 500,000 left, went into exile, including 15,000 slaves. And of that number, about 50,000 came to what is now British North America. So those are Loyalists that we think of when we think of Loyalists. And this is an illustration from the 1930s, and this is what we depicted a Loyalist as. More recently, here's a statue in Hamilton. So what do these people look like? They're white, They look well-to-do. Well, this is the stereotypical view of what a loyalist was. They were loyal because they had a steadfast loyalty to Britain, either emotional or ideological or political. They were conservative, possibly even reactionaries. They were Tories. Not the present day construction of Tory. I know there's an election coming up soon. It was presumed they were mostly middle class or upper class. Government officials, merchants, large landowners. It was thought they were all pretty well educated. Many of them had gone to college. And that they were uniformly members of the Church of England, now called Episcopalians in the United States. And you know what? Some of the Loyalists were exactly that. Some of the best known Loyalists were exactly that. However, it turns out that we need to broaden our idea of what a Loyalist was. First of all, loyalty was not always based on any kind of ideology or emotional attachment to Britain. And I'm going to come back to that in a second. It was a lot more pragmatic than that. In some cases, in many cases, the Loyalists were no more reactionary than many of the rebels. And I think perhaps we don't appreciate that the founders of the United States were actually pretty proud, conservative people. It was a conservative revolution. They came from all classes, not just the middle or upper class. Most were literate, but actually few of them had college educations. They were not all from the Church of England. They were from all over the religious map. And they weren't necessarily white European settlers. And they weren't even necessarily from the 13 colonies. Why would you become a loyalist? Well, if you lived in New York and Britain occupied the city for about 6 years, you might have found that it was in your interest to show superficial support, or you may have done business with the British occupying troops. It may have been financially to your advantage to be a loyalist. Sometimes you were a loyalist because you'd only just arrived in North America. And your family ties, your emotional ties were still to Britain, not because of any choice, but because your feet were still wet from the crossing of the Atlantic. It always puzzled me, Flora MacDonald, who I mean, who rescued Bonnie Prince Charlie during the 45, she and her husband were loyalists. They emigrated to North America, and the person who hid the prince trying to overcome the Georges becomes a loyalist. Economic self-interest, as I said, there were people making a living off trade with Britain or with the British occupiers. Sometimes people were loyalists because they were trying to decide who was the winning side. That makes sense today when gambling is going completely haywire. Many of them were members of a visible minority or a group seeking to protect their interests. For example, slaves. For example, Native Americans. So Britain issued a proclamation that the slave of any rebel who fled and made it safely to the British lines would be given their freedom. If you happened to be the slave of a loyalist, you were not set free. So some loyalists are brought here by their masters, and some come here as free people. But there are black loyalists, especially in Nova Scotia. Their descendants are still there today. Here are two of them. And Native America was divided when it came to the Revolutionary War, in many cases trying to shrewdly figure out which side was best or most likely to support their rights and interests. Many of the Iroquois support the British. This is perhaps the best known of them all, Joseph Brant, as he was known in English, who moved to what's now Ontario. So these are Loyalists. I'm going to add as well, and there's a slide that will bring this up, that if you were a disbanded British soldier, if you were someone living on Prince Edward Island who decided to enlist in the militia during the Revolutionary War, you were technically classified as a Loyalist. Not someone escaping from the state of, say New York or the Carolinas or Virginia. So let's look at the Loyalists who come here, those 50,000 Loyalists. I grew up thinking most of them went to Ontario because people from Ontario seem to think that's true. But it turns out the majority of them came to Nova Scotia, which at that time included Cape Breton, New Brunswick, not P.E.I. So about 19,000 of them came to Nova Scotia, and about half of that number to Shelburne, which I will show you in a second, which they were going to make the Boston of the North, until they found out the harbor was no good and the land around Shelburne was no good for anything, and they really didn't like the climate. Other than that, it was great. A lot of them went to New Brunswick. In fact, there's a colony there and a province there because of the Loyalists who were started arriving in 1784. Some went to Cape Breton, or at least the promise of them going there led to a colony being established in Cape Breton, which lasted until 1820. Between 500 and 1,000, we don't know how many came to St. John's Island, now P.E.I. Only about 12,000 became Upper Canada, now Ontario, and Lower Canada even fewer. About 1,800 of them are Iroquois, and about 3,000 of them are African Americans, both free and enslaved. So that has to complicate our idea of what a Loyalist is, and if nothing else, because the political part of the story is as boring as it gets. If nothing else, expand your idea of what we mean by Loyalist. In New Brunswick, they settled mostly on the river, St. John River. And in Nova Scotia, in Shelburne. Has anybody been to Shelburne? Nice little town. Briefly, the largest place in the region. This is what it looked like when the Loyalists were there. So why would they come? What were they entitled to? What was the price of loyalty? Well, not everybody was rewarded, and there was a sliding scale of reward or compensation. But the government of Britain did feel an obligation to compensate those people who had sacrificed because of their loyalty, for whatever loyalty reason, to Britain. So they were given land grants. The amount varied according to the status of the claimant. They got tools and supplies to get started, unless you were black, in which case you got the worst land and often no tools. You were given sometimes a pension, especially if you were a Loyalist officer. Some of them were actually women who were heads of family, and there's a whole sub-literature about women who were Loyalists, whose husbands left the family to go fight for the British, and these people became the heads of family and had to handle their exile. And some got pensions. So there's a compensation for the loss of land or property, and there's a pension for officers. So initially there was a distinction made between a Loyalist and a disbanded soldier. Some Loyalists were soldiers as well, including the people who fought in the island immigrants. A whole bunch of islanders enlisted in that unit during the Revolutionary War. Captain John MacDonald, his brother, some of the settlers in Tracadie enlisted in that unit. More fun and more money than trying to clear a forest on the upper reaches of the Hillsborough River. But also disbanded soldiers, people not from North America, but who received land grants after the war when they were let go. Including, a bunch of Hessians. Some Hessians came to Prince Edward Island, as we know. There were some Hessians wintered here, I think, at some point during the Revolutionary War, and some of them apparently liked what they saw. Am I
Great. That, you know, the Jenkins family on Prince Edward Island, that's an Anglicization of a Hessian family that came here. Anyway, we can bring that up with the Chief Justice, that's now retired. So that's the fun part. So if that wasn't fun, I'm sorry. By the way, I need to comment for a second on this illustration. I was talking about this before the lecture. This is a painting which I found online and traced to an archive in the United States, where it is listed as being Greenwich P.E.I. 1795. George Heriot is a known artist, worked for the government in Britain, in North America. And I thought, if you go to the restaurant on the road to the National Park in Greenwich, and you park on the side of the road and you look across the river to the Morel side, it does sort of look like that, but in between looks like the St. John River in New Brunswick. So this may be a mistake, but because there are very few images, early images of PEI, we're using it and we're claiming it as PEI until conclusively proven that it's New Brunswick. This is the illustration that ends up getting used instead, and it was done by memory. It was actually done in 1813, but based on a visit to Prince Edward Island in 1778. I used to do a trivia contest before the beginning of every class in island history, as you will recall, and multiple choice answers, and I asked them, where is this? Nobody gets Charlottetown. That's Charlottetown. What does that tell you about the needs of the colony and the state of the colony? That's 1778, during the Revolutionary War, only 6 years before Loyalists start arriving on Prince Edward Island. And that's the capital city. Well, this is another map that I used to use in class, showing some of the early settlement groups on St. John's Island. The proprietors who received virtually all of the townships on Prince Edward Island. Samuel Holland surveyed, George Dalton is here, not a surveyor but a descendant, surveyed the island into 67 20,000 acre lots, two of which were given to people involved in our fishery, one of which was reserved for the crown, and the rest were lotteried off in one afternoon in 1767 to mostly absentee landlords who had expressed an interest in acquiring land on St. John's Island because they were on the make and they had heard that there was good soil here. I know that's a long sentence. And they were constrained, among other things, to settle their lots within 10 years with at least 100 settlers who were not to come from any place in the British Empire, except for America, and only if they've been in America for a period of time beyond 1 year, and could not be Catholics, because as everyone knows, Catholics are suspect, especially in the 1780s. How many proprietors ever lived up to the terms of their grant? It also involved paying, quit rent, which was sort of like a property tax. It wasn't, but it's easier to call it a property tax. How many of the proprietors actually fulfilled the terms of their grant? 0. So in 1776, instead of 6,600 settlers, there were probably about 1,000. And then the government of Prince Edward Island learns that Loyalists are going to be rewarded with land by the British Crown, and governors of colonies are being instructed to accommodate Loyalists. And the governor of Prince Edward Island, a scallywag, saw in this opportunity to acquire settlers, an opportunity to cover the tracks of the skullduggery that his government had been involved with, chiefly himself and his allies. Suffice to say that government of Prince Edward Island, most government officials on PEI in the 1700s were, as our neighbor would have said, crooked as a dog's hind legs. Because that was what public service was like in those days. I mean, they were not outside the norm. Why are people coming to Prince Edward Island? I have simplified this for you. simplified what's actually in the Bumstead's book. They're seeking land. That is the biggest, I said this last year talking about the Irish. What is the great attraction of the New World? Why would you go into the unknown and the challenges of a wilderness? Because in the old world, the chances of you owning your own land were just about nil. So land, or the control of land, so if you're a tenant farmer, you at least want to get 100 acres of land at low rent with a 999-year lease. But if you're on the make, you might be able to acquire an estate. You might be able to become landed aristocracy, something that's never going to happen to you back in the old world. And land is the measure of a gentleman. So land provides status. Of course, they also are looking for income. This is a wilderness. The forest is just being cleared. People can barely feed themselves, not to talk about selling stuff to make money. So the best way to secure income is to get some kind of government appointment and get paid. Those are two very separate things in the early going on P.E.I. Most of the government officials who are going to be up to the chicanery that I'm about to describe weren't getting paid. But if you could get paid and you had land, then you were making a success of yourself, and that gave you status. The problem was, as Jack observed in his book, Land, Settlement, and Politics on the 18th century, Prince Edward, St. John's Island. He needed a better title. Maybe that's why the book didn't sell well. The peculiar conditions of the island produced a circular effect on the development. The officials, leading settlers, resented the proprietors, most of whom were absentees, at this point virtually all absentees, for their failure to fulfill the terms of their grants. I should have added that the quit rents were going to pay the salaries of the government officials, so when the quit rents weren't paid, the government officials weren't paid. At the same time, their economic social needs led to a rapacious devouring of any capital. So if you were a proprietor who actually invested in your property in St. John's Island, you're getting screwed over by the government. So why would you invest in your property in St. John's Island? Some proprietors invested quite a bit of money here, and none of them made any money. The Montgomery family, for example. Probably not the same as the family of, that's going to be the subject of the last lecture in the series. Or are they related to the Montgomerys?
No, they're from,
James Montgomery?
they're from, well, they may be back in the old land, but
Yeah.
not here. They're related to the Montgomerys and Maltech.
So Lucy Maud's
Yes.
almost as famous then as James Montgomery, the Lord Advocate of Scotland. Anyway, so it's a catch-22. People won't invest in St. John's Island because they're getting ripped off, but they're ripped off because they're not investing in St. John's Island and fulfilling the terms of their grants. So, there are two ways for the government to act about people who don't fulfill the terms of their grants. One of them is a sheet where you take back ownership of the estate. The other is distraint, where you seize their property and sell it in order to realize the money that you are owed. And that is the weapon that was used on St. John's Island, except that it was not done very honestly. And trust me, it's important to know this because the whole Loyalist question is tied up with the land question and is tied up with this auction. So, you choose the proprietors who have paid little attention to their estate or who happen to own land that you think is going to be valuable. Then you advertise an auction of their estates to get back the money that they owe to the government. And then you keep canceling the auction in case anybody should show up. And you make sure that you don't get word to Britain, where the proprietors actually are, in good enough time for them to pay their quit rents so they don't lose their land by auction. So you have to play a delicate game. Keep them from knowing their land is at risk, but at the same time, delay the auction to prevent more people from bidding up the lot. So when the auction was actually held, the only people who showed up were government officials or their agents, and they bought the estates at knockdown prices.
the lawyers.
Oh, they will come along before long. Some of them will be involved. Some of them will be fighting against it. So you don't even pay for the lots. You say, well, just take that off what you owe me in my salary. I'm paying £20 for the 10,000 acres. Just take it from what I'm owed. Conceal the details of the auction from the government in Britain and from the proprietors as long as possible, and muddy the waters by taking some of the land you have just bought somewhat dubiously and give it to Loyalists. Because if the government forces you to reverse those sales because they were not handled properly, those Loyalists are going to lose their property. And everybody wants to reward the Loyalists, don't they? Walter Patterson, the author of this plan, was extremely clever and pretty unscrupulous. We won't get into his sex life, although John Cousins is writing a biography of Walter Patterson, and I think it's going to be steamy. Let's just say the Stuarts turned against Walter Patterson because Chief Justice Stuart's young wife had an affair with Walter Patterson while he was upstairs with the gout. The governor used to come visit Stuart almost daily. Anyway, she ended up having to move to Quebec. But we're not going to talk about that. We're not going to talk about that. But the rest is so boring, we need to inject a little bit of sense in this kind of talk. All right. Anyway, that's Walter Patterson for you. Very plausible, very charming. On the make, and then covering up what he's done. And you'll notice, how many acres did he acquire? I forget. He had 100,000, and then another like 80,000 or so that he controlled for proprietors that he was representing. Yeah. Is it worth much money? Well, it's unsettled and uncleared for the most part. So most of its value is just potential. And then he issues a proclamation. This is courtesy. Doug Sobey gave me slides of the exhibit out in the museum. And I'm not going to try to untangle the Loyalists in the Quebec area. I'm going to show you a slide. And they don't necessarily acquire their land in the same way as other Loyalists. But they're also cut above a lot of Loyalists. Anyway, promised land on the same terms that they're getting in other parts of British America, and to be placed almost immediately on them. I like that. That in a few days after their arrival, they shall be put in the possession of such lands as they shall be entitled to, free of every expense. This is like, those offers that they make you on the internet now? Remember after my father was alone, my mother died. He never answered the phone when my mother was alive. But he used to answer the phone because he was lonely. And he would get calls from scammers. Like, you just won a cruise. And he'd go, that's great. I just won one last week. Or they would ask, is Michael MacDonald there? I'm sorry, we just came from his wake. Anyway, similar. They're not fishing. They actually are going to provide land grants to many people. All right. Yes, here's the slide I thought I had put in earlier, showing some of the principals who were involved in the acquisition of land. Philip Skalbeck, admittedly, is involved in this, but he's a lot more respectable than most of the other people involved. Anyway, so 18 of the proprietors made available 426,000 acres. 545 Loyalists, many of them in Shelburne, I don't know how many exactly, applied for land grants following the proclamation. 342 received locations. In other words, they were given, on paper, a plot of land. But that land tended to be on the townships which had been acquired through that land auction. So by 1788, Patterson was recalled in disgrace as Britain gradually became aware that he was stringing them along and basically not obeying orders. He was ordered to reverse the land sales, and he didn't. He managed to finesse that. But that leaves behind Loyalists saying, okay, I've been given land, but do I really own it? Or I applied for land, but I didn't get land. So how do you deal with the Loyalists? This map, Jack provided this map showing you where the land grants were made. And you see there are a few smaller areas in a darker check pattern. Those are where Loyalists actually settled. Now, in the Bedeque area, this was well chosen. William Skierman and those people he recruited chose well in this area. But Lot 54, which is where I'm from, is not a good place in 1784. And in fact, it has no settlers in 1784. It is a wilderness, and it's a long way from any place with no roads. So if you're a Loyalist and you were assigned land there, if you were assigned land, you might not take it up because say, what, go there and starve? So even when someone was assigned land, there's no guarantee they actually settled on it. And some of the proprietors, against British instructions, and I think I had this on another slide, some of the proprietors placed requirements on the settlers that they had to take up their land within a certain amount of time, or the offer was, it was like, you get the free cruise, but you have to, apply by the end of the week. Anyway, so technically that wasn't supposed to happen. Okay. A little side excursion into the Bedeque area. This is the only image that I know of, and maybe some of you can share images later, of an actual Loyalist who came to P.E.I. William Skierman's son, who was 13, he said, reading his caption, when he came to St. John's Island. Walter Patterson had acquired quite a bit of land in this area, by the way. He did actually own one lot. I think he had a brother, John, and they were co-owners of one lot from the lottery. 19, was it?
Yes.
That's one of the reasons we have Doug at these lectures, is to correct us when we're wrong. So Doug, these are all from the exhibit, these images, and they're great. So there's land acquired by Walter Patterson and John Patterson, including much of the Bedeque area. And here are, these are, I didn't even know these maps existed until I saw these in the exhibit map. Here are some of the land grants in the area. And in this particular area, every Loyalist was given water frontage. Now remember, this is a colony with essentially no roads. So you need to be on the water if you can in order to take advantage of the transportation that it affords. And so these grants included a small acreage on the water and then a much larger acreage inland, which would have been inaccessible and probably not all that attractive. And Doug went to an enormous amount of work to try to plot as closely as he could where the Loyalists that we know of who settled in the Bedeque area received their land. And there are a lot of names that you'll recognize there. Green, the Summerside house owner that gave the name of his home to the town, Summerside. The Linkletter Shore, Linkletters, etc., etc. We're not going to linger on this, but it's in the exhibit, so you can actually spend time on it. So, the next leader on Prince Edward Island, governor succeeding Walter, is Edmund Fanning, himself a Loyalist, who was born in what's now the United States, had been a leading government official, and had fought in a very nasty kind of guerrilla war on the British side during the Revolutionary War. So he is a prototypical, stereotypical Loyalist. And he becomes our governor. He was often dismissed as, Selkirk called him, a man of no superabundant head. which either means he had a very small head, or he thought he was rather dim-witted. Edmund Fanning was one of the shrewdest governors in the history of Prince Edward Island because he was the only one of the first 4 to retire and not get fired or recalled. And he feathered his own nest, and he placated the factions on Prince Edward Island, and he protected himself pretty effectively. But he had to address the Loyalist question. And this is the first of 4 attempts to settle the Loyalist question. And I'll just go through it very quickly. Empowered the governor to make land grants to Loyalists and disbanded soldiers. Soon they were all lumped together by virtue of previous locations. So if they had been given a location, I am now going to give you title to your grant or to your land. It applied to Loyalists who were settled on the properties provided by the governor and council if they had not already been given the title to the land. So people had been given assignments, but not necessarily deeds. There were some complications. First, almost all of the locations were on lots purchased by the Patterson crony group, not lots owned by the proprietors, other proprietors, and they were often remote. Many Loyalists had given up and left. This is 1790. 6 years later, many of them had given up getting title to their land and had moved on. So how do you find them? And are they still entitled? Should they still be entitled? Do they have to be Loyalists who settled on their assignments? And as I said, many of the proprietors had hedged their donations with some conditions, and in most cases they were requiring a start on settlement within 12 months, which was impossible for many people. So the Loyalist Act helped some people, but only a fraction of the Loyalists themselves. So he ended up making grants to 51 claimants, 16,000 acres. So remember, there were like, what's it, 465,000 acres or something like that? 16,000 acres. 40% of the Loyalists still on the island, as far as we can determine, received grants. So 51 claimants represents less than half of the Loyalists still resident on P.E.I, or I should say the heads of families. And few of those were living in 1798 on any of the lands that they were assigned or donated for that purpose. So we don't know where they were before 1798 in many cases. So in all, fewer than 100 of the Loyalists, so there were over 500 Loyalists applied for land on P.E.I. that we know of. Fewer than 100 had actually gotten their land. And Fanning, when he did give land grants, tended to settle them on the estate that he had acquired on Prince Edward Island. And Walter Patterson, he never reversed the land sale. So he didn't surrender the estates he had acquired in 1781, but he went bankrupt. And Edmund Fanning bought his estate from him. Is that wrong? Kind of a Costanza line, the Seinfeld episode. Is that wrong? Anyway. And he also, as it turns out, evicted some tenants from his estate because they had not fulfilled the conditions attached to the grant. So he helped a few, but not a lot. So, by the way, we are making progress here. We only have 60 years to go. There's another Loyalist bill in 1809. Again, this is when we have a new governor, Lieutenant Governor Desbar. Yes, who bears an astonishing resemblance to Bilbo Baggins. I run this is a slide I used in class. I used to run this by my class. It's amazing. C.D. Smith, Marty Feldman, twins. Anyway. Desbar was, I think 83 or 84 years old when he came to P.E.I. He lived to be over 100. So he was eventually recalled because they wanted someone younger with more energy. But supposedly he danced on a table when he turned 100. But he needed his own, there was an old boys club in P.E.I. There was a cabal, as it was often called, who controlled many of the appointments, controlled much of the government. Despard was not going to be held, hostage to them. So he was looking for his own guy, who turned out to be J.B. Palmer, who, again, was crooked as a dog's hind leg. Because he was a man on the make as well. He was a barrister from Ireland, left possibly in some disgrace. But he was the right-hand man of the governor. And we won't get into the loyal electors. There's a whole story there about a reform group, possibly a political party, depending on how you define it, called the loyal electors. But they passed the Loyalist Bill of 1809. I kind of did an Oprah thing. You get a grant, and you get a grant, and you get a grant. 3 grounds for compensation. Aren't you glad there's no test for this, by the way? I'm going to all these details, right? And you're going like, bottom line, doesn't turn out well. That's all you need to remember. Those receive, so 3 grounds for compensation. Those who receive, grants, but with onerous conditions, which specifically, explicitly, were not supposed to be required, so they deserved to receive their land. Those who were assigned a location, but never actually got their grant, and those who were denied even. So that's pretty much everybody. The bill passed. The legislature in P.E.I. was sent for royal assent to Britain, as most laws on P.E.I. had a suspending clause, that they could not go into action until they were approved by Britain, and sometimes they were not. So the bill proposed to confirm those with grants, even if they hadn't fulfilled the conditions, to give grants to those who showed up in the official records, but hadn't received their assignment, or individuals who had been given a location but hadn't settled on it, but could show it wasn't their fault if they didn't. The proprietors howled. The Crown, always susceptible to people, the rights of property, asked for more information. But nobody could find the records that would help to specify who was supposed to get land. According to the 1784 time period, those records had disappeared conveniently. And they weren't photocopied. So royal assent never came and the bill was dead. 1833, we took another crack at it. And this was much more modest. It was just trying to confirm all existing grants and deeds, regardless of whether the Loyalists had fulfilled the conditions imposed by the proprietors. So we had an elected lower house and an appointed upper house, and the upper house refused to endorse the bill passed by the House of Assembly. Doing what, if it had been in the days when you could appoint a commission, they would have said you should have appointed a commission. They pleaded the need for more information because the issue was now so complicated and protracted after so much time. So they said, what we should do is publish the draft bill in the press and ask for input from the public. And they did, and nothing happened. See how fast we can go towards the end. So, now we're in the 1830s. It is now, what's 1784, too bad it wasn't 1834. Okay, that's 50 years later. Most of the Loyalists are dead. Most of the original Loyalists are dead. So now it's, okay, do all of their heirs deserve land? And if so, do they all deserve the same amount of land? Or do they not get land because it was for their parent or their grandparent? Are Loyalists who left the island still entitled to grants if they want to come back from California, say? The proprietors, all of the virtually all of those lots in question had changed hands, sometimes several times. So it's not the same person who offered land was not now the family that owned it. So do they get compensation because they now have to surrender land to the Loyalists? If so, how much? How should they become cash, land grants someplace else? The government has no crown land. They can't say, we'll swap land with you. So the problem is now almost intractable. But that didn't stop us from trying again, because this is Prince Edward Island. This is like the Toronto Blue Jays coming up on the draft. I'm sorry, the trade deadline. So in 1839, radical land reform party called the Escheat Party controlled the assembly, and they are elected on a platform that the government should escheat every single estate on Prince Edward Island because no proprietor ever fulfilled the terms of their grants, and so they are forfeit. And that land should be given to the tenants who live on it because they had earned the moral right to own the property through the sweat of their brow because they're the ones who gave it value. So this is, the lower house is controlled by the Escheaters, and they take a crack with the Loyalist bill in 1839. They simply resurrected the 1833 bill. It was passed by both the council, which was still appointed at that point, sent to London for royal assent. But the Attorney General of the province, of the colony, Hodgson, later to become a knight and the first islander to be our governor, he accompanied it with an opinion that, you really shouldn't give royal assent to this. Because everything is too complicated and murky after 50 years. And you're going to set precedents, they're going to affect property rights, don't approve it. So they didn't. I probably should have shown you that slide. There's Robert Hodgson. He looks like the kind of person that would advise withholding assent. Anyway, one last shot. The famous Land Commission of 1860. Here are the commissioners, one appointed by the proprietors, one to represent those that were actually renting land, and one representing the government. They were appointed to settle the land question full stop, but in the course of their hearings and in their report they addressed the Loyalist question, and they felt that the Loyalists had been victims of injustice and deception. And while they had no legal right to land grants still, they were entitled to land grants as compensation. And the government in Britain went, thank you. Thank you for your input. In fact, their whole report was set aside by the government. They recommended a solution to the land question that would have worked and essentially was the template for how the land question was solved in the 1870s. But the proprietors lobbied successfully against it, and the government of Britain set it aside, including any recommendations for the Loyalists. And by that time, if any Loyalist was still alive, they probably died of frustration. End of story. Yes, I created that slide. So what does that teach us? I shouldn't leave the mic. It is an exercise in frustration and injustice and deception. The Loyalists who came to Prince Edward Island, those Loyalists that we can identify as basically the stereotypical Loyalists, became the pawns in the land question. And the longer their claims went without being redressed, like the land question itself, the longer the land question went without a resolution, the harder it became to resolve. And so by the time there is a willingness to resolve this question for the Loyalists, it has become so complicated that, as much for legal reasons as anything else, the governments won't touch it. So those of you who are Loyalists, you are entitled to land. Anyway, thank you.
Any questions? Yes, Cynthia.
Yes, thank you very much. I was just wondering, I understood that for some of the loyalists, that the government had asked people who owned land to give 1/4 of their land to the loyalists. And in William Sturman's case, I think he money
Yeah.
every year,
He bought land,
and
did
he
he not?
ended up buying his own land.
Yeah, he ended up buying his own land, so he's a bit of an exception. So what happened was that the Patterson, cabal approached some, proprietors in Britain and said, would you make land available for loyalist settlement? And often they were people, often members of the government of P.E.I. were acting as agents for the, like an absentee who's living and not even close to their property. So often the proprietors who volunteer land are friends of or associates of members of the government. But a lot of the land that's provided for the loyalists comes from land seized during those, or that auction in 1781. And you'll notice that Patterson settles a whole bunch of loyalists on his lots, on his property, because it gives them value if they actually settle. I have this feeling Patterson couldn't care less whether they actually came. He's trying to conceal his acquisition of the property, and he's also saying, if they do come, this is great. If they don't come, no skin off my nose. But so a lot of the proprietors in this instance are now government officials who have added to or acquired property. I mean, the Stewarts own property in P.E.I. already, for example. They were adding to their properties. Phillips Caldeck, I'm not sure, he wasn't an original proprietor, so he acquires the estate.
How did the experience for those that stayed in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Ontario, so how was the land addressed there? Is P.E.I. unique or is it similar?
It is unique because the landholding situation in P.E.I. is unique because alone of all the colonies, the government had virtually no crown land. They had retained lot 66, which was 10,000 acres. So every place else, the government has millions of acres of crown land that they control. And the government can say, we will make available land in these areas. And that's actually turned out to be a lot more efficient than the proprietors having to donate land because otherwise there's no land to be made available. So on paper, it looks very generous of the proprietors. Say, we own all this land and we are going to surrender it. Because they're not going to say, I will rent you land. What they're saying is, I will give you land. But as we noticed, some of the proprietors said, yeah, but you have to settle it within a year, or the deal is off. What do they gain from that? If people settle in an area, all the real estate in that area gains value, right? The rest of your lot suddenly becomes more valuable because there's a critical mass of settlement. And so there's business and trade, and there's agricultural surpluses, and roads are built. And so even though you've given away land, you make money on the back end.
Interesting.
Yeah, so but every place else, there's crown land for government. Is their experience equally good or much better other places? It's checkered just the same. And if you're a black loyalist, as I said, often you don't get the land, or if you're assigned land, it's worthless, and you're not given the same level of supplies. Because the valuable land, the land deemed valuable, is saved for more important people. So not everybody does well. Yes?
Yeah, I'm from Vermont, and during the Revolution, a number of those folks went Loyalist. But a number of them came back after the war. Is there any sense, after all this confusion, all this frustration on the island, any sense of the numbers of Loyalists that returned to the States?
I know Doug may have a comment that some did, for sure, but I don't know that we have numbers. Like, I couldn't give you like a percentage. But once things die down, once the animosity dies down, there are Loyalists who do go back.
Yes, and it's a very difficult group to follow because of the 30 heads of family who settled in this area, about a dozen didn't take up the land. Some of them end up like Sensabaugh down in Murray Harbour.
Yeah.
And
So
some
they
in
stay on
Charlotte.
PEI, but they end up
Yeah.
settling someplace
But the
else.
ones who disappear completely, you don't know where they've gone. And recent research, for example, Moorfield ends up in Shediac. But equally, interestingly, in this area, you get people who arrive after 1784.
Yeah.
You get, for example, John Small, I think it is, and they're still descendants.
I noticed that on your display.
Yes. On the display out there, it shows, we have the 1798 census, and we have the 1784 land grants. And I tried to trace, how many are still there, and some new ones have come in, and from New Brunswick. And we have a student working in the museum, Samuel Ricks is the name of the student. Samuel Ricks is the name of his Loyalist ancestor as well. And Samuel Ricks tried to establish in New Brunswick near Fredericton and gave up. Sometimes the land wasn't very good in New Brunswick either. And the island was much better,
With immigration in general, there's a tendency for us to think that people come from a place and they settle in a place. And the reality turns out in many cases to be very different. That sometimes people move around quite a bit before they put down roots, until they find the right place. This is particularly true of Irish immigrants to PEI, because they come later and they have fewer resources, and so they don't get to pick and choose a good place to settle. Sometimes they're lucky, the Kincora area is good soil. My ancestor chose the highest point of land between Cardigan and the north shore of PEI. After coming to PEI the previous year, stayed the first year, or I should say, I guess, a winter on the Baldwin's Road. He obviously scouted out land, but he couldn't have known that was good farmland. It turned out that it was. But in many cases, people get to a place and either they're not up for clearing land. Imagine if you were a middle-class office holder with lily white hands and someone hands you a shovel and says, those 500 acres with all the trees on them, good luck. So people often don't stay, or someone says, I'm tired of waiting to get my assignment, or I'm tired of getting a deed for my property, I'm going to move to Murray Harbour because the Cambridge family have a fishery going down there and there's work. Those are stories that only the family historians uncover for us.
Sorry to ask a second question. I just wanted to know what happened to the Mi'kmaq during this time? Were they given land, or, this topic is still
That's a really, really good question.
What's the question?
The question is what happened to the Mi'kmaq at this time? Were they given land, or was land set aside for them? The answer could be very long. The fact of the matter is, when France transferred Ile Saint-Jean to the British, they pretended it was empty. There was no acknowledgement that the Mi'kmaq lived on the island. And even later, when it was acknowledged that they did, often they maintained the fiction that they were summer visitors only, but they didn't really live here. They just came here in the summer. Sorry, anyone who's a summer islander.
Just pay more tax.
We double tax you because you don't vote here. You can't get mad at us. So the Mi'kmaq, it's hard to know how many Mi'kmaq were here at contact. It looks like experts think the environment would support up to 1,000 or 1,200 Mi'kmaq. But when we start counting Mi'kmaq in the 1800s, there are 200-300. And they've never surrendered or signed away their land, but they are simply ignored as if they do not exist. And as long as settlement is thin on the ground, they continue to live much as they had before. It's only when settlement begins to multiply and all of a sudden their movement and their access to resources is restricted that European settlement really starts to bite. And that's happening by the 1830s for sure. The Acadians had a good relationship with the Mi'kmaq. I think it's perhaps sometimes overemphasized. If the Acadians had been around long enough to multiply enough to put pressure on the environment, that relationship might have been frayed. But they definitely got along better than the British did with the Mi'kmaq. And not just because there weren't a lot of them. George, speaking of Acadians.
Yeah, the missionary who was serving the Mi'kmaq, who was in Cape Breton, came to the island a number of times. In 1751, something like that, he was on the island and he wrote to the governor, because usually the governor from Louisbourg would come with gifts for the natives. And he said there was on the island, across the island, 101 Mi'kmaq. There was 35 men probably who would carry arms, I guess, against the British, and the rest were older men, women, and children. And he stresses, there's 101, and they're all living in the on the east side of Maltic Bay.
The Mi'kmaq lifestyle involved seasonally moving across the landscape at various points of resources available. So what we don't know for sure whether the Mi'kmaq wintered on Prince Edward Island. What we do know, some of the experts, is that there was enough resources for some Mi'kmaq to have lived here year-round. To my mind, it doesn't really matter whether we were seasonally occupied by the Mi'kmaq or whether they were here 10 months of the year or 12 months of the year. This was their territory. But I said, the British essentially ignored the fact that they were here. So there's no kind of arrangement made at this time. Every now and then when there was a war going on, they worried about whether the Mi'kmaq might side with the other guys. Because the Mi'kmaq were effective and feared kind of irregular warriors, very much feared. And so then the British became nicer to the Mi'kmaq during the Revolutionary War, during the War of 1812. After the War of 1812, they ceased to be a military factor. Other comments or questions? How many here are the descendants of Loyalists? Quite a few. Well, I used to, because my ancestors were not Loyalists, I used to think there was too much of a fuss made about the Loyalists because there weren't all that many of them. But you know what? The point that's made about them is true. They punched well above their weight. However many of them, and Loyalists, the book that compiled the genealogy of the Loyalists kept coming up with more and more Loyalists, and that's partly because some of them were Loyalists because they were disbanded soldiers or because they were people who were in the militia here. But the Loyalists that we think of in the traditional sense punched well above their weight. I take back any uncharitable thoughts I had when I was 22 years old about the Loyalists.
Any other questions? And also they had a regional significance. In this particular area, in 1784, they were the first settlers to stay. The Acadians had been here for 8 years, 1750 to 1758. A dozen to 20 households in deportation occurred, and some escaped deportation. About 1758 to 84, that's about 25 years or so, when the Loyalists came, that was the final settlement. And it affected, I think, subsequent arrivals. And they moved inland as well, into Freetown and into Middleton, and they left a considerable impression. But I don't know if they really thought of themselves as a unified group, and used the term Loyalists.
No. That is an invention, essentially, of the mid-1800s, whether the whole idea of British Empire Loyalists, life association, especially post-War of 1812, and often late Loyalists, like Americans who moved to Canada well after the Revolutionary War, kind of get lumped in with Loyalists and confuses the issue. But regionally on P.E.I., but regionally, there was no New Brunswick until there were Loyalists. That is the rationale for the province, the colony, and even
Upper Canada, arguably, is a Loyalist, creation. And Cape Breton, if it had been able to sustain itself as a colony, was created because of the Loyalists. Well, here on PEI, as we know, a lot of Loyalists achieved their prominence over the generations. And I was on the way down, I was thinking that Baddeck and Belfast are very similar, not in terms of their origin stories, because Belfast is all Scots, but if you want to think about communities with pride of place, with a cohesion, with an economic security, those two communities are banner communities in PEI, who take pride in themselves without being stuck up about it, who take pride in themselves and have really fashioned a strong sense of community. And that's one of the reasons I love to come down here to talk. I came twice just in one summer.
So this is your fourth time.
Something like that. Anyway, so compliments to you for coming.
Well, I want
And you have announcements.
I want to first of all thank you for your interesting talk today, covering a lot of complex material with and maintaining the interest of the audience in complex legal.
That's why I put the text.
And in appreciation, I want to give you a small token of appreciation for having come. So
Thank you very much.
thank you very much.